The key point, though, is, as I said, when we're talking about these processes, is that the modeling part is just the tip of the iceberg, and that all the heavy lifting is around the data preparation side. So typically in our digital world, what might this look like? Well, this is where we get into something called ETL, extraction, transformation, and loading. And some of the work we've done in this field has followed this sort of core kind of process. And were many of you in Ross Jenkins' talk yesterday? No? Okay, missed a good one, I'm afraid. So Ross was talking a little bit about this yesterday, and I just thought I'd sort of drill into that in a little bit more detail. Obviously, with my slides aren't quite as pretty as Ross's, but then I don't work for a creative agency. So the source or the key source we're starting off with is essentially click-level data. So what we're doing here essentially is getting the data out of the web analytics technology. So this might be going back, say, to your Web Trends SDC log files. It may be taking a data feed from one of the other technologies. But essentially what we're starting here with is raw click-level data. It's horrible, it's messy, it's noisy, it's a bit like other people's children. So we've got to sort of start to deal with that. And the first thing we need to do is to reduce the noise. So we need to start making decisions, but this comes from our process saying, what is it that we need out of all this horrible, noisy, messy data? We don't need every click. We don't need every page view. What we need to understand within each visit are certain key events. That's really what's important to us. We're all beginning to already extract some of those signals. So let's take some of those key events. It might be the fact that a PDF was downloaded. It might be that someone actually just went to a certain content section. It might be that they viewed a particular banner. It might be whatever. But we've got to reduce the data, and this is essentially a data reduction exercise. So we can begin to create a sort of a view of the session where we're stripping out all the noise and we're saying, some signals here. And then we can begin to aggregate this to say a visitor. So we're building up, if you like, a file around the visitor. So we now have an entity, which we call a visitor, which actually aggregates all the interesting stuff about that visitor. And it's still at a very granular level. If you've got a decent-sized website, these are still very big files. But at this point, we can also begin to layer in, as Adam was talking about this morning, other stuff. So we might, for example, bring in other visitor-level data. We might include some stuff that maybe we've captured from survey programs, voice of the customer programs, and actually layer some of that kind of stuff in if we've got the linkages, if we've got that one-to-one relationship. We might also bring in, as Adam was describing this morning, sort of customer kind of data, other data we've captured elsewhere in our systems, to augment and enhance that view that we have of the visitor. And this gives us essentially the platform. This gives us the transformation of the data that we need to then be able to say, okay, let's go at this with our analytics toolkit. And that toolkit can be whatever it is that you have. And there are a variety of systems and workbenches out there, from SAS to SPSS to Clementine to KXEN, who provide, if you like, this statistical analytics toolkit. They're open source as well, something called R, which is an open source program, and there's lots of stuff out there. So let's not worry too much about the sort of the brands, but really here we're talking about the toolkit. And then we can begin to use our tools on this new kind of data. And then we can just start to do things a bit differently. This morning, actually, the guy from Google was talking about things like first click, last click attribution. If I have this custom centric data factory, I can ask any question I like. And this isn't particularly data mining. It's just saying, let's have a look at the data in a different way. I want to look at it by first click and by last click. So what channels are driving what kind of behavior? I can do things like aggregate search keywords in whichever way I want to do, say based upon some kind of text analysis or sort of searching for particular words or whatever, and aggregate and classify search in different ways. So these sorts of things become more possible because I've got the data out of the constraints of the traditional technologies. I can develop my own custom attribution models, so looking at not only converting visits, but also influencing visits or assists in any way that I choose. So these things start to become possible. But the web analytics technologies are getting there as well. But here, really what we're talking about is moving towards much more sophisticated, if you like, statistical-based analytical techniques based around a number of different areas. So, for example, segmentation, propensity modeling, so about classification of people into groups, propensity modeling, looking at people's propensity to do things or not to do things, classifying people according to certain outcomes, or forecasting, for example, trying to predict what sales might be in the future, as an example. What I want to do really for the rest of the session is just show you a couple of case studies, one based around segmentation and one based around propensity models, just to sort of try and visualize this stuff a bit better for you. So, segmentation, who are your visitors? One of the techniques I've picked up really, having presented on this side of the Atlantic a number of times now, is from my American colleagues, is to ask questions. So, for example, how many of you, this is about 100,000 people, how many of you have 100,000 people a day coming to your websites? Okay, so most of you, yeah. So, this is 1 million people. How many of you have, say, 1 million a week coming to your websites? Yep. Okay. How many of you are fed up with being asked questions by presenters? Yeah. See, in the UK, we wouldn't put our hands out, we'd just be going, yeah, okay. So this is 1 million people. And this is sort of how we treat them. I know the resolution isn't very good on the screen, but there's big, amorphous kind of mass, you know. There's no real discrimination, it's just there, it's a big blur. And as a result, we sort of tend to sort of develop increasingly this sort of one-size-fits-all kind of experience. And really sort of the role of segmentation is to begin to tease out, really, who are these people and what is it about them that makes them different. So the classical definition of segmentation is around taking a group of people and splitting it into subgroups. And what those subgroups have is something in common. But importantly, what they have in common is different from group to group. And in marketing terms, that generally means trying to find something about a group of people you can do something about. You can leverage that information. And typically, we segment people one of 3 ways. We might segment people demographically. And this is very traditional marketing. Target marketing based around, say, gender, age, or lifestyle. And that may or may not be useful in our digital world. In fact, some of the work that we've done show there are very different attitudes and behaviors towards digital platforms and channels based upon people's age and their gender. We might segment people and try to find and understand differences according to their attitudes. So not about who they are, but what they think, their satisfaction, their brand preferences within a market or within a category. Or we might segment them according to not who they are or what they think, but how they behave. What do they do? So, for example, you know, what content do they browse? What products do they buy? How do they respond to different types of marketing campaigns? These are all different ways that we might segment. In our world, though, typically, the most obvious approach is to segment people behaviorally. Why? Because we have loads of data about behavior. And we can actually then also do something about it. So that's maybe, you know, about what to segment. And then the question is, when it comes to behaviors, how might we segment? Well, for me, there are 2 basic approaches. First of all, what I call deterministic segmentation. That's pretty much where we are with our web analytics technologies today. Yeah? We decide the rules. We create some hierarchies. We may generate some filters in our reports. But we decide how we're going to sort of chunk this data up, how we're going to split these people. We might say, I'm going to segment based on visitor frequency. I'm going to segment based on channel of acquisition. I might even, if I've got the right kind of tools, segment on all of these things together. But essentially, we're still trying to decide how to segment. We're still determining the outcomes from our segmentation approach. So what's the other approach? Well, the other approach is more discovery-based. So this is letting, in a sense, the data do the talking. It requires a different toolkit. It requires a different set of algorithms. To some extent, it requires a different expertise as well. And what we're really doing here is saying, okay, well, let's find some associations in this data. Let's perhaps find some correlations or some patterns that we may not have thought about. So this is where we get perhaps those aha moments that, again, Adam was talking about this morning. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, is that really the case? Now, it might be the case, but is it any good? Does it make sense for the business? Those are still the tests that we need to validate. Let me show you an example based upon a case study we did with the Royal Mail. So the Royal Mail is essentially the postal service in the UK, one of the biggest organisations in the country, and as a result has one of the biggest websites in terms of traffic in the country as well. This is a relatively old screenshot from the time when we did the work with the Royal Mail. And they essentially had in place a very sort of basic deterministic segmentation based around you're either a business customer or you're a personal customer. You weren't really allowed to be anything else. And it didn't matter whether you were IBM as a business or you were a small corner shop as a business, you were a business customer. So what we were asked to do was to try and find out whether there were other ways perhaps about thinking about the audience who comes or came to the Royal Mail website. So what we did is we took their data, they were using Omniture Site Catalyst at the time, and essentially started to create that visitor level history that I was showing you a little bit earlier. And I'll just sort of give you a little example of how these things work. So let's pretend this is a sort of a visitor record. So we're looking at individual visitors here, and we set up the key events, behaviors that we were interested in. I've got only from A to G here, but this was a very fat file that went into many, many, many different attributes that we were potentially interested in. So what we could see here is that visitor 1, 2, 3 did B and C, not D and E, and did F and G. And so we created this data set of all these attributes of all these visitors. And then essentially we use a technique called cluster analysis to basically say, let's try and group all these visitors together into similar behaviors. Now, one of the things about this kind of approach is you have no idea what's going to come out. So we set the algorithm running, like that. It's pretty cool, isn't it? Where we did that. Do it again. And what we began to see was that the algorithm told us there was some pattern based around visitor 128, 130, and 124, because they were exhibiting similar behavior. So we could see in the data here that they had all visited B, they'd all visited D, and there was a little bit of noise always in the system. And then these guys had a set of behaviors that were very similar, and then these guys had a set of behaviors that were very similar as well. So the job now is to try and interpret this and say, well, what is it that these guys are actually doing? So we actually look at the data and try and interpret that in terms of, well, does that make sense? It might make sense statistically, but does it make sense commercially? Can I actually do anything with this? An important part of that process then is adding in additional data. So we understand their behaviors, but who are they? And of course, it's never really like this because there are holes all over the place. So you have to do the best you can. It's not a perfect science. And in fact, I sometimes like to think it's as much art as it is science in terms of understanding and interpreting these kinds of analyses. So by adding in other profiling data, so for example, bringing in CRM data or other data from your web analytics system, perhaps also bringing in attitudinal data from perhaps a voice of the customer program, we can begin to interpret these clusters and these segments and actually begin to understand who they are. In this particular case, what we ended up with were 12 very distinct sets of behaviors on this one website.